protection areas, these areas continue into the city. Just happens to be the city of Augusta. So within the city of Augusta, the wellhead protection is underneath the jurisdiction of the city. These areas outside of the city are under the jurisdiction of the county.
Correct. Correct.
Something a little different is the manure storage ordinance. As Amanda mentioned, we have jurisdiction within the entire county. There was an instance within the city of Augusta where there was a manure storage structure being built improperly. Our office was able to have that removed. So for the manure storage, we do have jurisdiction in the city, not for some of these other wellhead protection measures within the city.
And that'll be also a distinction I'll make as well, is when I talk about like the shoreline or the floodplain in the unincorporated areas. In the incorporated areas, our division doesn't have any regulation over. They have their own rules within the incorporated areas under state statutes that they follow. So whereas Greg mentioned they were maybe able to go in the incorporated area for their purpose, our division doesn't have any jurisdiction within those incorporated areas. We don't have any say over those. So in the wellhead protection, here we do define a few animal confinement facilities, animal waste storage facility, and feedlots. I didn't necessarily want to, I guess, go into too much detail once again, trying to stay sort of high up here, but within the zones here, there are listed permitted uses, and they do actually list prohibited uses within those. Some of these, I believe, are outlined in all three as prohibited uses, and they refer zone 2 and zone 3 refer to zone 1 if it's a prohibited use. Okay, so there's protection in that sense in the wellhead areas then outlined in those cross-hatched areas to protect for these types of uses then, okay, as prohibited. So other than that, I guess I won't go into too much more detail on the wellhead protection. It doesn't cover a large area of Eau Claire County and the unincorporated. So are there any other questions on the wellhead protection? So the last one here, the Shoreline Protection Overlay District, once again, under Wisconsin statute there, 5969-2. These are the two areas for the jurisdiction where we're able to cover them. Once again, this covers all of Eau Claire County, except for the incorporated areas. Once again, like City of Eau Claire, City of Altoona, we don't have any jurisdiction over. They have their own statutes through the state that they need to follow. This was a section, a title that was pulled out then. It used to be in our Title 18. It's now Title 20. The area I feel that was most appropriate to this discussion, once again, we do outline here that livestock facilities, facilities, housing animals, manure storage areas, barnyards, or feedlots need to follow certain requirements. And there's these two that lay them out. Either one, they need to be at least 300 feet or more from the ordinary high water mark, or two, if they're going to be allowed within that area. I didn't go through outlining each one specifically, but there's A through D that basically they need to follow for regulations for that, or not regulations, but standards for that then. Okay. In general, too, in the Shoreline Overlay District, then, if there's any type of grading, excavating, dredging, or tilling, there is also permits and or standards they need to follow with that, which we've actually tied back into 1705, which is something that Amanda talked with previously. So that's where some of the correlation comes from land conservation and the land use controls division that we try to use, depending on the development, similar standards, I guess, or practices to follow. So like I said, this usually is going to be in tangent with floodplain. Not all areas that are considered a navigable waterway have floodplain. So that would be some areas where these two don't apply, but a lot of times you'll find these two very similar in the area. So otherwise, that concludes then at least what I have for our land use controls divisions and what we have thus far. So once again, the Title 18 comprehensive revision that we're going through as a department, as a county, is going to be looking more specifically towards general zoning and then our subdivision ordinance. It's not necessarily diving into the shoreline overlay protection or the floodplain. Those two are administrative codes that the state statutes have that we, in a sense, basically have a few minor edits or tweaks to, but otherwise we basically follow that. Rod was beginning to help with following. There's a model ordinance for floodplain that we're going to be maybe adopting, in a most general sense, when we go through this comprehensive revision. But the shoreline zoning, the state statutes say if something is stated in there, we have to follow it. Okay, so we can't be more or less restricted. We have to follow those rules. So those administrative codes kind of tie us to very similar to what Gary was pointing before. If the state statutes call out, or have them, that's what we need to follow. So the general zoning is where right now maybe there's a little bit of possible change or room to grow or add some things in regarding this discussion here. So any questions on any of the areas that I just touched on here that our division oversees or anything else? All right.
I'll take the time to undo the twisty time. What I'm going to do today is just give a quick overview of some of the statewide rules, regulations. We are going to be diving into some of these topics at our next meeting, but I just want to give you all a quick overview of this, potentially so that you can start formulating questions for when the experts are actually here next month. Some of the existing regulations within the state of Wisconsin are incorporated into the administrative code known as NR 151. One thing I'm going to do is apologize. We use acronyms way too often. I try to avoid that. The NR 151 are the Agriculture Performance Standards and Prohibitions. I'll try to spell out what it is as whenever I use it, but just, again, I apologize up front. As the question was earlier, the Ag Performance Standards prohibitions do apply to all farms within the state of Wisconsin, regardless if there's livestock on the operation or not. Cost sharing is one of the requirements which is incorporated within the state code. We cannot compel someone to follow the NR 151 standards unless we are providing cost sharing, or if they participate in the farmland preservation program, or if they happen to become a permitted facility as a CAFO. And then there's a few other weird instances where they can also be required to follow the Ag performance standards. But in general sense, we do have to provide cost sharing to bring a farm into compliance. In essence, everyone was grandfathered in, and to bring a facility into compliance, we need to provide cost sharing. The Ag performance standards include the manure storage, construction, and closure standards. So the question earlier about the our manure storage ordinance, it's also part of NR 151. So there is a tie in there. Manure runoff from barnyards and feedlots are also covered in stored manure outside of a constructed manure storage facility, such as a manure pile. There's also cropland erosion requirements, that the cropland erosion must be down to the soil's tolerable soil loss level, which we also refer to as the T value. There's a requirement for nutrient management on cropland. That's all cropland, regardless if it receives manure or not. Any cropland that's receiving nutrients, which can include from grazing animals, is also required to have a nutrient management plan. There's a limit to livestock access next to streams, lakes, rivers, also tillage setbacks from streams, lakes, and rivers. There's also a requirement for wastewater runoff. That would include milk house water and so on. So these are a quick look at what some of those Ag performance standards are. Yes, question.
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about bringing NR 151 as a county
Yes.
make all farms not only apply to at our department, but have the county be enforcing it for all farms. So in order to bring all of the existing facilities that were grandfathered in, would the county be doing cost sharing to do that local regulation?
We would still be required to have to provide caution. Okay.
So what is that exactly?
Cost sharing for nutrient management is $40 per acre. Under the existing, we receive grant money from the state of Wisconsin to provide out for nutrient management cost sharing to farmers on an annual basis. What was the number you came up with, Amanda? At the existing rate, which we receive money, 90 years it'll take us to cover the county.
That's assuming they don't cut it.
And that's assuming they don't cut anything at the state.
So how often are those nutrient management plans having to be revised? In other words, to pay for the initial nutrient management plan, but is it an annual cost for the farmer to go back to his expert and then have it updated?
It's a requirement for the plan to be updated annually.
And so do you know whether the cost is the same each, or just for updating the plan that was done originally?
Cost varies for development of a nutrient management plan. We host workshops where farmers can develop their own nutrient management plan, and we have plenty of farmers that do that. You can hire an agronomist to do that. There is already a cost of updating your soil samples every 4 years. So that's a given cost regardless.
So even those people
Their own,
doing their own,
there's a cost for
they're
updating.
going to have the soils tested.
Yes.
So, talking about, again, going back to talking about like NR1B1 being a local measure. I'm hearing that we might do that, and then I'm also hearing that would take 90 years to actually do that. That's kind of what I'm understanding.
Okay, we're probably jumping ahead, but I'll try to answer this as best I can. Yep. Right now, under the rules and regulations we have in place today, if my farm is not in compliance with one of these standards, my office could come and try to work with me to bring my farm into compliance because I've got cropland erosion problems and I have not developed a nutrient management plan. Amanda could offer me cost sharing, which is now providing a cost share opportunity to me. I could say no. At that time, our office made a valid offer of cost share to me to come into compliance. Technically, that's the time I have to come into compliance. Either I take the money and come into compliance, or I turn away the money and still have to come into compliance. So that's the existing rules today. Now, what we have today is our office does not have the ability to follow up on any enforcement to compel me to follow that nutrient management plan. We now have to turn over to the Department of Natural Resources for further follow-up. Our office does the legwork, but then we cannot take it any farther. Does that help answer your question?
But under the operation level, still you would have to have the money to offer these funds.
Correct.
Whether, they want to help, they want to get a management plan, but they don't.
Yes. There are some things such as stacking of an unconfined manure pile next to a stream, which is one of these prohibitions. We had one of these examples last spring of 2017. Manure coming from an adjoining county, and it was piled next to a wetland area in clear violation of NR 151. I could not issue a citation for a clear violation of NR 151 as we did not have enforcement authority. There's no cost sharing involved with correcting that. So some of these do not require cost sharing because there is no cost sharing needed to bring that into compliance. But that was one which we had to refer to Department of Natural Resources. And I think Department of Justice may have that now. But that was actually an ongoing violation. That was an additional violation to an ongoing series of violations for that operation. Yes.
What percentage of Oakland County parks are opted?
We have about 20% of the cropland underneath nutrient management plans. Each one of these are individually, we don't have those specific numbers. Okay.
It's less than half, you would say, though.
Yes.
Okay.
There are farmers who are probably in compliance with these things when we just don't have the actual record of that. There are quite a few farms I know that are following these things, and we just don't have a record of that. Within ag performance standards, there is also a limit on what local ordinances and regulations can do. We do need to get approval through the state for potentially going beyond the NR 151 standards. That's really going to be a good discussion point for next month when we have the State Department of Ag people here for this presentation. I just wanted to make you all aware that it is a possibility, but it's something we would have to do. One thing I did skip over, what's not on this slide, is a new targeted performance standard which applies in areas with Silurian, dolomitic, bedrock, in essence karst topography, which we do not have within Eau Claire County. It applies in the eastern part of the county, it applies of the state, it applies in the western part of the state, and some horseshoes down through the southern part of the state. That's a targeted area with a targeted set of rules which deal with nutrient management and manure management. They do not apply within the county, so I have not even included those here. Any other questions? We are trying to keep things on a broad scope for everyone, kind of get some background information. So is there any other questions in regards to NR 151 at this time? Otherwise, underneath state rules is an option available to a county or a town if they want to adopt to implement livestock siting. There's two different ways that livestock siting can be implemented. One is by adopting an ordinance, a zoning ordinance. So it would become a part of a zoning code, which would give some ability for the siting of livestock facilities. Notice it says for siting, not additional rules and regulations, it's more for the location of that facility. Another way to do it is through a licensing. Licensing has a benefit in that it can be applied into non-zoned towns. So that is the difference between a zoning ordinance, which would be underneath zoning, and a licensing approach. We do, once again, become restricted by the NR 151 state ag performance standards and prohibitions. Property lines and road setback become some of the things which are restricted underneath this option, that we cannot require setbacks greater than what the state has within their standards from property lines or road right-of-ways. Livestock sighting rules had when they first became a part of the state rules, 2006, I believe was the year, there were counties that had already adopted zoning or licensing type of ordinances which were very similar to livestock sighting. At that time, the state statutes stated that they could not be more restrictive than the state, so they had to change their rules to match the NR 151 standards, but they were allowed to keep a lower threshold if their old existing ordinance started at a lower number. I know Jackson County had a license ordinance in place, and they started at 10 animal units. They were able to maintain that 10 animal unit when they changed their existing rules to match the livestock sighting rules. So they were grandfathered in to be able to start at 10 animal units. Under the rules, if you come in to start new, you cannot start less than 500 animal units. That was the quick overview on livestock sighting. Any questions on that? Yes.
Clark doesn't do that now?
Eau Claire County, we are identified by the state as having, I would call it a quasi livestock sighting, because as Jared mentioned, we have within some of those ag zoning districts thresholds of 150 animal units. So it is a zoning that puts a threshold number on. It doesn't have the incorporation of state standards as far as NR 151 into those standards or into that zoning code. So if you go to the livestock sighting website that Department of Agriculture maintains, they have identified Eau Claire County as having livestock sighting rules, but it's not a full livestock sighting in that we just have that 150 animal unit requirement, which requires them to have a nutrient management plan. And I think that's the extent of the requirements.
So if this group chose to recommend that the full suite be adopted, would the 150 be grandfathered in?
My understanding is no. But that is a very good question for 2 weeks from today. My last conversations with the state livestock people is no. We would be back to the 500 animal units, because we did not change our rules and adopt the livestock sighting rules in 2006 when the change occurred. We would have had made a revision to the zoning code at that time. Yes?
Yeah, it seems to me that in reading about the citing rules, that you can cover most of those rules under another, like operations, like waste treatment, waste storage. So the only thing you're not covering then is what distance from roads or whatever for the actual site of the buildings.
In essence, yes.
That would be a problem.
Yeah. Livestock sighting is probably really going to help you on some of the property line setbacks.
But still, you're still going to have counties ride, you know, and just say, you have a barn that's closer than somebody county road.
The setbacks, I think, within livestock setting are very similar to existing.
So in other
Road
words,
setbacks.
Your zoning, rule would still apply out there in the county.
Yeah.
As far as the setback from county highways.
Yep, road right away. Yep.
townships.
So yeah, this is good learning about how some of these things potentially interact with each other. Under the DNR regulations of NR 243 is where the rules are for the animal feeding operations, the confined animal feeding operations. I think we've already mentioned that if someone becomes a large facility, such as the one we visited last week in the morning, they do have to follow the NR 151 standards. Plus, there are further restrictions. Some of their manure management requirements are a little bit different. In essence, they need to have zero discharge. Talked a little bit earlier about barnyard runoff. There's allowable amounts of barnyard runoff underneath the state performance standards. In essence, they become zero discharge. Again, I just wanted to kind of give a high overview of this. We're going to have further discussion on this topic in January. That's all I'm covering on CAFOs at this time. Most of these are things we've already discussed. So that's a quick overview of some of the existing rules and regulations we have within the county and across the state and how some of these apply. We really want you to get background information on these things before we really dive into these things. So does anyone have any questions of me?
Just a comment, I think we'll see how our local ordinance, other local ordinances are going on out there and other how we compare and what we're doing well and what we might want to consider duplicating here.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, Manny, you want to jot down a note, a comparison table for, I think that actually exists already. The Department of Ag has kind of worked on that already for a comparison for counties. That is one thing which, with the changes in the manure storage standards by NRCS, we are adopting those things instantaneously once they're adopted by the state. We're further advanced than some other counties. Some counties have a 1985 reference in their code, and that's the standard they are still following. So in one instance, I know we are fairly advanced with that adoption.
There's manure storage ordinance that Bayfield County adopted, and some of those ordinances make really good reading because not that we would necessarily want to adopt and do the same, but giving us an idea of what is in a manure ordinance storage ordinance. So, and that's available online. The counties, if you go to that, Bayfield County.
Yeah.
And they're probably, oh, I know, when I was at that DATCAP meeting, that training meeting earlier this year,
Mm-hmm.
I think they said, someone said that Sauk County had the best manure storage ordinance. And that, I think that was somebody from DATCAP who said that.
I know Sauk County has incorporated more of an operational, not just construction, but then operational type
So that might be
requirements.
I haven't looked it up yet, but I'm gonna, you know, if you could put out a couple of, those references where people can go and go to the county site and download it. It just is helpful, I think, to read those other ordinances that counties have adopted.
Yeah, that's something I guess we could incorporate into what we put on our web pages, links to other places, because we're familiar with a lot of these links and maybe not so readily available.
Ordinances regarding.
Anything else? Anyone else have any questions?
Are we going to be hearing at all about the actual end result? So the part like we're describing there would be, I guess it'd be more relevant if we knew, okay, the ones with the more restrictive had better groundwater report results over time or worse. It seems like a big piece of the puzzle that we're missing is, so what is the actual problem? Or are we to assume that?
That was going to be part of the discussion we're going to have in January about the groundwater report and the recommendations. Some of the information we don't have for groundwater within Eau Claire County. So we're going to bring that in as part of our background information. Have some of these, Sauk County, for instance, has their manure storage ordinance helped with groundwater protection? I do not know what they have for studies to show one way or another.
Well, and they're new too.
And they're potentially new.
And that, from what I hear, the nitrates and the phosphorus they're in the sediment, they're in the groundwater, and you don't get them out.
Yep. And potentially nitrates within the groundwater are legacy from 50 years ago.
There are some studies that show the effect of changing practices, but they're on a really small scale, not a whole county, because it takes so long for a whole county to respond to an ordinance change without the big picture. So they do these studies on smaller watersheds, and they're groundwater studies and surface water studies that show when you make these changes on the landscape, how does surface water change? So and we can bring some of that stuff into this group, but they're hopeful because local responds quicker than regional. Like the whole county is going to respond slower than the groundwater around an individual couple of fields where you change something.
Yeah. These are all things we will be trying to educate ourselves on and be exploring as we move forward. Anyone else have any questions? Yes.
Do you think that we could have the PowerPoints printed for our meeting?
Would you like them printed for the meetings?
Or
Released online.
it'd be nice to be able to take notes.
Okay. Okay. We can do that. Anything else? I will try to get the PowerPoints from the state presenters in advance, potentially on our webpage so that you could actually print them off even in advance. Otherwise, we will bring them with. Anything else? Otherwise, Gary.
Just for you entertain a motion to adjourn or something?
This development of consensus, I don't know, somewhat. I don't know if anybody has anything else that they want to add. If not,
just make a comment on that. I'm not sure yet. I've had any discussions in this group, how easy it's going to be to reach consensus. But I would certainly think that, say if there's a vote, there's a minority, that should be listed. You know, so it isn't just, I can't think of any committee I've ever been on where there's been consensus on everything.
That was the point I was trying to make
I mean,
earlier, that
you know, come on.
each night we're gonna vote on it and act on it.
And you can miss the vote.
That's reported in the vote, isn't it?
Right.
Voted against.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's fine. Why?
So I to reach consensus with them.
Someone from the majority have to request. Here it's from the minority. They want to have the minority.
I guess, yeah, we'll just kind of play it by ears.
Okay.
And, future meeting dates, the next two, December 7th, and then January 15th from the DNRs. And, yeah, all our meetings are at 1 o'clock.
Yes, all of our meetings will be at 1 o'clock
Be at 1 o'clock.
within this room here.
And I guess with nothing else to discuss on the agenda, I guess I'll adjourn. And I'll thank everybody for attending and.
Yeah, I have 20 copies here of Wisconsin Farmers Union policy on the issues that we're going to be discussing here over the next couple of months. And basically that is what our statewide membership has adopted, is what we want to see in these situations. So 20 copies here, should go out to the committee people first, and then after that, general public can have it out. So, what do you guys want on that, right?
We've also printed out portions of the farmland preservation and the manure storage.
I got it.
One another.
I always work sure on it. This is a bit chilly though, I noticed that one.
Say, well, what is the final thing that?
I'll take the whole water.
You don't have a copy of one of those in your office?
I don't, just better than my toe, actually. Yeah.
I sure am glad I was born great. What the Swedes did everything.
Okay.
When does they get a problem? What's happening now?
Yeah, it starts getting everybody looking the same.
I worked with Alex.
Right. Is there anything actually like motion and vote on it, you know, I don't see that be a discussion.
Right now, no. Once we get into things, there will be.
The issue we have.
Yes, I'd like to.
Did everybody get a copy of this that's on the committee? You guys want any of these?
We're gonna wait. I was gonna wait for